A cinematic documentary exploring the Pacific War, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and how American military power ended World War II and reshaped global history forever. Even before the formal surrender of Nazi Germany on May 8, 1945, the political and military leadership of the United States had already shifted its focus to the final and most unforgiving battlefield of the Second World War. In the Pacific, the conflict had taken on a uniquely brutal character. Since Pearl Harbor, it had become clear that Imperial Japan was not fighting merely for territory, but for an absolute vision of honor, duty, and sacrifice. Every battle across the Pacific Islands demonstrated that this was an enemy willing to fight to the last man, regardless of the human cost. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa were not simply battles, they were bloody warnings of what awaited any direct invasion of the Japanese home islands. As American naval and air supremacy became undeniable, preparations for the final blow began to shake tape. Operation Downfall was conceived as the largest amphibious invasion in human history, divided into two massive phases. Operation Olympic, scheduled for October 1945, would land the U.S. Sixth Army on the beaches of Kyushu, aiming to secure airfields and establish a foothold for the decisive assault. This would be followed in March 1946 by Operation Coronet, an even larger invasion of the Kanto Plain near Tokyo itself, involving the U.S. 1st, 8th, and 10th Armies. It was an audacious plan, and a terrifying one in terms of human consequences. Japan's geography made these invasion plans almost obvious to Japanese strategists, who responded with their own desperate defense strategy, Operation Ketsugo. The defense of the homeland became a total national effort. Veteran divisions were withdrawn from Manchuria, dozens of new units were raised, and millions of civilians were mobilized and trained to resist the invasion. Japan prepared to turn every beach, every mountain pass, and every city into a killing ground. Casualty projections were staggering. Even the most seasoned Allied commanders were shaken by estimates that foresaw hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese dead in a direct invasion. While these invasion plans loomed, Japan was already being devastated from the air. The introduction of the B-29 superfortress allowed the United States to strike directly at the heart of the Japanese home islands. After early logistical failures in China, the capture of the Mariana Islands transformed the Pacific into a permanent launch platform for strategic bombing. Under the command of General Curtis LeMay, American air strategy abandoned high-altitude precision bombing in favor of relentless low-altitude incendiary attacks. Entire cities were reduced to ash. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 alone killed tens of thousands in a single night and became the most destructive conventional air raid in history. Yet even as its cities burned, Japan refused to surrender. Its leadership believed that by inflicting unbearable losses on an invading force, it could still force a negotiated peace. It was within this deadly stalemate that an entirely new force entered the equation. Since 1942, under the strictest secrecy, the United States had assembled scientists, engineers, and vast industrial resources under the Manhattan Project. The objective was unprecedented: to unlock the power of the atom and turn it into a weapon. When successful tests confirmed the feasibility of the atomic bomb, it became clear this was not merely a new weapon, it was a fundamental break in the history of warfare. Preparation for its use was meticulous and shrouded in secrecy. Air crews trained repeatedly without knowing the true nature of their mission. Every technical and operational detail was calculated with absolute precision, because the weapon's impact would be psychological and political as much as military. Target selection reflected this reality. A special committee evaluated cities that combined military value, industrial significance, and symbolic impact. Cities largely untouched by previous bombing were deliberately chosen so the bomb's destructive power would be unmistakable. Hiroshima and Nagasaki emerged as targets that met these criteria. Before the final decision, the United States made one last attempt to avoid the ultimate step. Millions of leaflets were dropped over Japanese cities, warning civilians of impending destruction and urging evacuation. At the same time, Allied leaders issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender and warning of total devastation if the war continued. The Japanese response was vague and ultimately interpreted as rejection. Then, in a single moment, the world changed forever. The first atomic bomb was dropped, and an entire city was annihilated in seconds. The scale of destruction was immediate, absolute, and without precedent in human history. Days later, a second atomic strike confirmed that this was not a warning, but a new strategic reality. Warfare had entered the nuclear age. Faced with annihilation and the sudden entry of the Soviet Union into the war against Japan, the Japanese leadership collapsed. For the first time in history, the emperor intervened directly, addressing the nation and announcing surrender. The Pacific War was over. World War II had finally come to an end, closing the deadliest chapter humanity had ever known. The American-led occupation that followed transformed Japan at its core. Political, economic, and social reforms dismantled militarism and rebuilt the nation into a constitutional democracy. A former enemy became a strategic ally, marking one of the most remarkable post-war reconstructions of the 20th century. The consequences of the atomic bombings extended far beyond the end of the war. Humanity had entered the nuclear age, where power was no longer measured solely by armies and fleets, but by the ability to unleash total destruction. The victory was decisive, but the moral, strategic, and human questions endured. In the final days of 1945, not only did a war end, a new global order was born, forged in the shadow of the most powerful weapon ever created by mankind.